Have you ever just looked at your family and thought, man, it feels like we're all stuck in the same loop, seeing the same struggles play out over and over again? Well, today we're diving into a source that offers a really old and a very, very different explanation for why that happens. Let's get into the family seed. It's a question I think a lot of us have asked ourselves at some point. Why? Why do the same anxieties, the same kinds of bad luck, the same dysfunctions seem to just pop up in our families generation after generation? It's a heavy one for sure. Maybe for one family, it's a specific illness. For another, it's a type of behavior or a string of bad luck. The source we're exploring today, well, it frames this problem in a really direct way. It sees a clear pattern, a continuation that feels almost unbreakable. So, the source we're looking at gives this whole phenomenon a pretty dramatic name. It calls it a repeating family nightmare. So let's break down exactly what they mean by that. Okay, so what's super interesting here is how the source material breaks this down into two different types. First, you've got what it calls identical suffering. This is pretty straightforward. The exact same problem, like depression, just gets passed right down the line. But then there's this other idea, varied suffering. This is where each generation gets hit with something different, but the family itself is just in this constant state of struggle. The main takeaway here is that, either way, a chain of suffering is there. So, if it's not just some cosmic coincidence, then what is the cause? This brings us to the absolute core idea of this entire source text. It introduces this ancient concept it calls the czar, or the spiritual seed. So the word czar actually comes from the Amharic language, and it literally just means seed. But, and this is the key part, according to this text, we are not talking about a metaphor. It defines czar as a literal family demon that gets passed down just like a biological seed, like a form of spiritual inheritance. And this is where you really see the sheer scope of the issues the source connects back to, this one single concept. We're not just talking about feelings here. The text links the czar to literally everything from narcissism and financial ruin to broken marriages, addictions, and even physical sicknesses that doctors just can't explain. Now, this obviously brings us to a huge point of conflict, right? How does this ancient spiritual idea line up with our modern scientific understanding of the world? So, Section 3 looks at just that, modern science versus the demon. So, what we have here are two completely different stories, trying to explain the exact same pain. On one hand, modern science points to things we know, like hereditary depression, genetic markers, maybe just learned behaviors from our parents. But the source text comes in and argues, nope, there's a single spiritual root cause for all of it, the czar. And this quote, wow, it really just cuts right to the heart of the source's entire argument. The claim they're making is that society didn't find a new cause for this suffering. It just swapped out an old spiritual word for a new scientific one to describe the same old problem. And if you follow their logic, this leads to a really powerful conclusion. If the root cause isn't actually psychological or biological, then of course, psychological or medical treatments are going to fall short. The source is basically saying you're using the wrong tools for the job. Okay, so if we're following this line of thinking, the next question is pretty obvious. How does a family end up with a czar in the first place? Section 4, How the Czar Spreads, dives right into that. According to the source, there are two main doorways. The first is family idolatry, which basically means things your ancestors did, worshiping other gods, forbidden rituals, that kind of thing. But the second one is much more modern, an individual right now going to get help from people like channelers, mediums, or fortune tellers. And the text is really, really specific that this isn't just about ancient history. It points to a whole list of modern spiritual and New Age practices, everything from tarot and astrology to things like Reiki as potential open doors for the czar's influence. And here's where the source describes a really deceptive twist. It claims the czar can actually make a person feel like they have special psychic abilities or spiritual gifts. It's like it mimics real intuition to draw the person deeper and deeper into these practices, making them think they're helping people, when really they're spreading this influence. So once it's in a family line, how does it get passed on? Well, the text lays out a whole life cycle. It says it can happen in the womb or at the exact moment of birth. It could be implanted during childhood, maybe after a big trauma. And if none of that happens, the source claims there's a kind of spiritual rule that says when a parent dies, the czar just automatically passes to one of the kids. The seed has to keep going.
All right, so after laying out this entire pretty intense spiritual framework, the source finally gets to the big question. What can you actually do about it? This final section is all about the solution, uprooting the family demon.
First, the source addresses why just trying really hard on your own often doesn't work. I mean, people can see the pattern, right? They genuinely want to change, they make these promises to themselves, I won't be like them. But the source argues they fail over and over because they're fighting an internal spiritual battle, not just a bad habit or a psychological issue.
And this all leads to the source's most crucial point. A spiritual problem needs a spiritual solution. Drawing from what it identifies as Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, it lays out 4 steps. First, recognize the problem is there. Second, disconnect from any related objects, tarot cards, crystals, whatever. Third, repent, and this has to be done as a family. And finally, commit to intense spiritual practices like prayer and fasting.
And that leaves us with this final question, which really, truly gets to the heart of what this source material is all about. It challenges you to think, if a problem's roots aren't in the mind or in the body, then maybe the solution isn't found there either. It's a pretty powerful thought to end on.